were very much the same as the Scout law which we have now. We are their descendants, and we ought to keep up their good name and follow in their steps.
Baden-Powell even suggested that Scouting had a lineage that led all the way to the king. He noted that the king signs himself R.I., Rex Imperator, the emperor. He says, Imperator comes from two Roman words, im and perere, which together mean to prepare for, that is, to be prepared, which rather neatly makes the king the chief scout. It's neat, but it isn't true. Imperator just means he who rules, but no one was going to object, and certainly not the king.
Edward VII returned the favour in autumn 1909, when he knighted Baden-Powell. By now, the Scout movement had over 100,000 members. Scout troops were patrolling across the country, and a spin-off magazine was flying off the newsstands. Scout fever had gripped the nation.
Scouting offered something special that other groups didn't. At its core was a belief in the positive power of play and make-believe. Scouting for Boys is peppered with ideas for staging little plays, dramatising poems, putting on a show, and it encouraged each boy to imagine himself as a potential hero on the bigger stage of life.
Playing and play-acting had always been central to Baden-Powell's understanding of the world. Peter Pan, one of the most popular shows of the age, was especially dear to him.
Baden-Powell was particularly fixated on it, even more so than its standard enthusiastic audience. I think that was because the figure of the boy who never grows up, who never loses his milk teeth, who never has to confront the horrors of sexuality, was to him a very, very compelling image.
The idea that Scouts were boys on the brink of sexual maturity was a problem for Baden-Powell. And the thought that they might be tempted to indulge in self-abuse, as the Edwardians termed it, horrified him. But in typically forthright manner, he drafted a section of Scouting for Boys to confront it directly. No prudish sentimentality for him. He even checked his copy with his mother. Pearson, his publisher, however, was much more coy. He rejected the original, and Baden-Powell was forced to replace it with a watered-down version for instructors only.
This is from the appendix on masturbation, and this is what he wanted to say. The result of self-abuse is always, mind you, always, that the boy after a time becomes weak and nervous and shy. He gets headaches, probably palpitations of the heart, and if he carries on too far, he very often goes out of his mind and becomes an idiot.
Yep.
It's quite extreme, isn't it?
It's very extreme. It's more extreme than even fairly conservative medical authority would have gone in the early 20th century.
But there was a huge amount of anxiety about masturbation.
Huge anxiety around masturbation because, on the one hand, it caused, all these problems with health. It led to consumption, insanity, etc. And on the other hand, this argument that it's a manifestation of a lack of self-discipline. It erodes the willpower. If a boy gets into this habit, he will not be a fit person to govern the empire.
Part of me thinks that Baden-Powell is trying to do something quite healthy by saying we're far too prudish about this.
I think it's good that he's actually ventilating, he's talking about it. We want to get this kind of out in the open, out into the healthy fresh air and sunlight.
Yeah. Why do you think his publisher wouldn't put it in?
There is this concern in saying, oh God, there's this terrible habit that boys get into at school in adolescence and they learn it from their evil companions, yada, yada, yada. We should warn them about it. And then other people come back and say, no, they are pure innocent little lambs, you know, you will just put this evil thought into their mind. It's like the sex education debate, you know, about, you know, whether you tell them or whether, you know, oh my God, you tell them about it and they go and do it.
Don't lark about with a girl who you wouldn't like your mother or sister to see you with. Don't make love to any girl unless you mean to marry her.
Despite his confident assertions, Baden-Powell was no expert on the charms of the opposite sex.
Whereas he would often apply the word beautiful to a man, he would never apply it to a woman. She might be good-looking, but he would then often qualify it with a word like heavyish or some sort of slightly derogatory remark. I obviously read Baden-Powell's diary remarkably carefully, and there was an entry in the diary which said just, went to Charterhouse, saw Todd's photograph album, naked boys and trees, excellent. I'm sure it was nothing sort of overtly sexual, but clearly Baden-Powell did very much enjoy looking at these naked boys.
For Edwardian society, an aesthetic appreciation of the young male form was distinct from finding it sexually arousing. Whilst works like these were being exhibited in public, no one saw Baden-Powell's interest in boys' bodies as evidence of paedophilia or even homosexuality, least of all Baden-Powell himself. Times have changed.
If Baden-Powell tried to start scouting today, I don't think he'd have got very far. Media interest in a national hero no longer stops at the bedroom door. And an unmarried, unattached, confirmed bachelor who admired pictures of naked boys would be unlikely to be allowed to be in charge of a youth movement.
However, Baden-Powell scholars still don't agree on his true inclinations.
It should be possible to speak of a sexual preference that is in a way a non-preference. Yeah, I don't want to do this sex thing. I genuinely believe that Baden-Powell was the eternal Peter Pan, and that rather than being a repressed gay man, he was in fact asexual.
He thought that actually men who did commit too early to sexual relationships with women were contaminated, which I think in a way is, you know, you don't think that unless you're gay.
Baden-Powell may have backed away from women, but they didn't shy away from him. Yet he didn't give marriage any serious thought until his mother began to put him under pressure. Olav Soames was only 23 to Baden-Powell's 54 when he met her in 1912. She was a tomboy, interested in sports and games, and they shared an instant rapport, marrying less than a year later.
She was completely unclothes conscious, never painted her face, as it was described. Baden-Powell thought the best women weren't really very much interested in sex, and I think that that would be certainly true of her. He did get her pregnant with Peter, and he managed subsequent pregnancies. But after that, he slept out on a balcony for the rest of his life.
There was a single bed on a veranda outside the front of their house, and it was an open veranda, and he would go upstairs to bed, having sat around a fire, actually sat almost on the embers to keep warm. He'd then go upstairs, climb into this bed with 2 blankets and a pillow, and they'd come out in the morning in the winter, and they'd actually dust the snow off. Quite extraordinary.
The boys of Britain at the start of the 20th century had no interest in the romantic life of the chief scout. They were just thrilled that, unlike most Edwardian adults, he refused to patronise them. He entrusted them with civic tasks, like giving first aid or directing people in fog. Responsibility, he believed, developed character.
Of course, this had its funny side, and Baden-Powell was the first to admit that his fad of scouting might appear ridiculous, and others were quick to join in the joke. This is a Punch cartoon from as early as 1909, which seems to be laughing at the idea of the Scouts coming to the rescue. It shows a very small boy attempting to help a rather large lady across the beach. And he says, "Fear not, Grandma. No danger can befall you now. I'm with you." Yet crucially, it's titled Our Youngest Line of Defence. And this isn't any old lady. This is Mrs. Britannia, who stands for the entire British Empire, which the Scouts have been charged with saving.
Remember that the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago was comparatively just as great as the British Empire of today. It fell at last, chiefly because the young Romans gave up soldiering and manliness altogether. Don't be disgraced like the young Romans, who lost the empire of their forefathers by being wishy-washy slackers without any go or patriotism in them.
Edwardians were obsessed with the idea of losing the British Empire. When thinking of a really serious enemy like the Germans, most senior army officers were convinced that we might lose. And it would be the loss of the empire, even of our country, our national wealth. It would have been really a catastrophe.
By 1914, a generation of boys had been immersed in the book's patriotism and primed to see themselves as literal protectors of the nation.
Every boy ought to learn how to shoot and to obey orders, else he is no more good when war breaks out than an old woman, and merely gets killed like a squealing rabbit, unable to defend himself.
So it might seem that the First World War was the call to arms which Baden-Powell had been preparing for all along.
Baden-Powell insisted that every boy be able to handle a weapon, but he refused to see his scout movement as a sort of military cadet force. Indeed, Baden-Powell defended himself against charges of militarism in Scouting for Boys. He said there was a world of difference between self-defence, standing up to bullies on the international stage, and bloodthirsty warmongering.
When an eminent public man wrote to me that I ought not to teach boys soldiering because, as he puts it, he hates war like the devil, I felt bound to reply that had he actually seen anything of war himself, he would, like most soldiers, hate it worse than the devil.
Rather than see his scouts become a branch of the armed forces, the chief scout offered his boys for civilian duties, running errands, working in Red Cross centres, and coast watching. But the war inevitably took its toll on the scouting movement. 250,000 former scouts and scoutmasters fought for king and country, of whom 10,000 died. Among the fatalities were 5 of the 20 boys who joined Baden-Powell on Brownsea Island back in 1907. After the catastrophe of World War, Baden-Powell decided that scouting had to become a force for world peace. The imperialism of the original handbook was soon eclipsed by the internationalist message of global scouting.
That's what we're after, to try and breed in the next oncoming generation that spirit of friendship, comradeship, and goodwill, which is the true foundation for peace in the world.
That hope proved illusory, but the scouting ideal continued throughout the 20th century, even though other youth movements with less worthy aims borrowed heavily from its trappings. The communist Soviet pioneers, the Italian young fascists, and infamously the Hitler Youth. But to assume that all boys in shorts are brainwashed stormtroopers in waiting does a grave injustice to Baden-Powell's Edwardian experiment. After all, which of these movements didn't mind